Before we get into our discussion, it's important for us to state that the Higher Education Reform Experts South Africa is a European Union-funded project. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of our guests and our guests alone. They do not represent or reflect the official policy or position of HERESA or the member institutions and organizations by whom our guests are employed. Unless otherwise stated, HERESA does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, view, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in the HERESA podcast. Welcome to the HERESA podcast, where we'll have engaging, stimulating, and hopefully worthwhile conversations on issues, themes, and concerns in higher education. My name is Kanyam Jadli, and I am the Media Liaison Officer for Technological Higher Education Network South Africa, or THENSA, which is a coalition of technology-focused institutions based in South Africa. I'll be the host of this conversation, but in future we'll have a number of other hosts featured on the HERESA podcast. For those of you who aren't in the know, HERESA is an Erasmus Plus capacity building project for higher education, which THENSA established in partnership with Orbial Global Observatory in Spain and the South African Qualifications Authority, or SAQA. As a pilot project that will take place over 3 years in THENSA's member institutions, HERESA seeks to build a network of higher education reform experts in South Africa based on the Higher Education Reform Experts model in the EU neighborhood. HERESA aims to strengthen and revitalize teaching and learning strategies in the areas of entrepreneurship of teaching and learning, work-integrated learning, competency-based learning, and curriculum development for the fourth industrial revolution. This edition of the HERESA podcast is part of a series on our communities of practice, which we established last year. After the official launch of this podcast, you'll be able to find episodes of this series under the podcast tab on our website, which is www.heresa.thensa.co.za. In this introductory episode, we will focus on defining a community of practice, or COP, as it's commonly called. And here to discuss this form of social learning and its relevance to higher education is Dr. Helen McGuirk, who is the head of the Hincks Centre for Entrepreneurship Excellence at Munster Technological University in Ireland. Dr. McGuirk's work focuses on supporting entrepreneurship in all its forms at a regional, national, and international level. This involves leading a strong team of researchers, managing various publicly funded projects, and supporting staff and students. Her research, which focuses on 4 interrelated topics of entrepreneurship competitiveness, the economics of innovation, and public policy. She has presented her work at 40 plus international conferences and is published in top-ranked peer-reviewed journals. She has many years of industry experience in project management, financial service, and as an entrepreneur in Ireland and Australia. Helen, thank you so much for joining us on the HERESA podcast.
Good afternoon.
Great. So I'd like to start with what might strike you as a rather basic question, and that is, what in your view is a community of practice?
Yeah, it's a question. There is no definite definition. For me, as an academic, it's sharing ideas, sharing both ways. So I learn from my peers and peers learn from me. So sharing of ideas and the community is coming together, maybe one-to-one, but also, and probably more so in a larger group, a group of peers. So if they're all academics, or if they're all students, or if they're a support team, peers learning from each other.
Right. Is there a difference between a community and a community of practice? I was reading on this topic, and one point that I came across was just because you have a community of people who share common interest doesn't necessarily mean you have a community of practice. Are there any specific characteristics that distinguish a community of practice from other communities, like a neighborhood, for example, or maybe, to be quite superficial, a group of Beyoncé fans on the internet?
Well, I'd have to say it's the first time I've had Beyoncé communities and academic communities being compared. But you know what? I'm sure there are similarities. Um, so, communities of practice from, say, an entrepreneurship point of view, and particularly around entrepreneurship educators and researchers, is the willingness to share. So you can come together, as you mentioned, with shared ideas and shared love for some particular topic, but a willingness to share, a willingness to learn from each other. Sometimes communities of practice are referred to as learning communities, where we are willing, being the main word, to learn from each other. So I think that's probably the key, willingness and learning. So peers learning from each other. Again, we're going back to this peer learning. So yeah, I think similarities to Beyoncé, maybe that's for another podcast.
Very true, very true. So you mentioned peer learning. And I think if you look at the higher education sector, you'll notice that academics tend to work in isolation across various disciplines. How does a community of practice combat that tendency to work in silos?
Yeah, that working in isolation is all the more reason and the importance of communities of practice. So for instance, as a PhD student way back when I was in the University of Limerick, we worked as PhD students on our own. It wasn't until a few of us over coffee said, maybe others want to share, the trials and tribulations of being a PhD student. So we formed a very informal group. We later learned that that's what it was a community of practice, or a learning community, where we came together and we shared our ideas. I think it's more so in the last maybe 5 to 10 years that all academics realised that yes, there is merit in working on your own, but we also have to share our ideas, whether it's ideas of our very specific research, but also sharing ideas from projects like the HERESA project. We have to tell the world about what our findings. It also increases impact. So it has multiple levels of benefits where you're a member of or a contributing member of a community of practice. So yeah, I think it's very important.
Right. Within HERESA, we've established our 4 COPs, each with their own chair. And my question to you is, how can the chairs ensure that their COPs are beneficial and worthwhile to all involved? Are there some basic pointers that you can provide them with, as well as our visitors and partners who might be interested in forming their own COPs?
Yeah, great question. From my experience, we have a community of practice. It's internal to the Munster Technological University. It's called the Community of Practice for Entrepreneurship Educators and Researchers, so CPER, and also as a member of the Community of Practice with the HERESA. I think empowerment and remembering that these communities of practice are for peers, so they should be driven by the peers or by the participants. So that idea that it's not just up to the chairs. The chair will organize the Zoom link, for instance. The chair might ask in advance for a particular speaker. But I think the community of practice, to have it's easy to set up something, but it's that idea of sustaining such a grouping. And that is, in my opinion, it is around empowering the participants. So, for instance, you might have a participant maybe from a a university down south where they give a talk and they might have a discussant, but let the speaker maybe find a discussant in a university in the north of the country. So therefore you have a cross-discipline maybe, or cross-regional, but it is not all from a push. It is empowering the speaker, say, to have a discussant. And you might also have that discussant contact somebody else that will ask a few questions. So there are many, shall we say, tricks of the trade.
Right.
And also rotating the chair is probably a good idea. We do that here in CPEER. So that just, there are 2 pointers that I would suggest.
Right. I think those 2 pointers, empowering certain members and rotating the chair, fits quite nicely into my next question, which is, I imagine, much like a group project, not that the two are comparable, but COPs will have members who are more vocal than others. And there'll be members who are a bit shy to share their knowledge or contribute ideas. How do you work around people's bashfulness or fear that their ideas are not good enough? And to add on to that, how do you avoid a COP becoming too cliquey or prioritizing those who appear to bring more to the table?
Great question. Yes, and I think what you've listed there are issues that, in my experience, having been involved and continue to be involved in different communities of practice, they are issues that we experience at different levels, at different times. So it's a matter of working through it. Can I just take one? So your first point about some participants are more vocal than others, and how do you get the more, maybe the quieter people,
right.
but also maybe the early career. And the early career academic in the group with, longer term, very experienced faculty members in the same group. I think that comes with the culture of really emphasizing, and probably this is a task of the chair, really emphasizing the idea of peer learning. We can all learn from each other. So that is probably the first step to ensure that everybody benefits, I suppose. But also, we all learn in different ways. So some people learn from, being very vocal and talking, but other people learn from just listening. But it's trying to encourage the quieter ones to give their opinion. So I think that's goes back to my earlier discussion about, or my earlier idea of having maybe one speaker in the group speak, but have a discussant and somebody that's going to ask a question. So say if you had a professor, very experienced, giving a talk, well, that professor, and you'll tend to find, give them the opportunity, they will support early career. So you're encouraging at every step of the community of practice to encourage early career, but maybe not even early career, maybe people that are well experienced and have lots to share, but wouldn't be as vocal as somebody else. The skill of a chair, and the skill of the chair supporting the peer learning idea. That's how I would answer that really crucial part of the communities of practice, and the community of practice, the sustainability of it. Does that answer that question,
Definitely.
Tanya, or have I missed out on another part of that?
No, definitely. I think it very much answers the question, and I think it really offers pointers on how to work around some of those challenges. And I like the fact that you mentioned, early academics, because we have a lot of young academics who may not have a great deal of teaching experience, and therefore they're not as confident in the ideas. But I think what you've suggested will really help in terms of navigating the COP. You mentioned your experiences as a PhD student and how these informal learning groups that you sort of formed with other PhD students were COPs, but you didn't know that at the time. And from what I've read, you seem to have taken, and I hope I don't offend you by saying this, but a less conventional path into academia. You traveled abroad, you started a cafe, you gained industry experience in project management and financial services. Do you think the diversity of your working experience gave you a greater appreciation for collaborative approaches to learning?
Yeah. So I'm one of these, what you would term, or what we term in Ireland, is a mature student. So I came to academia when my children were school-going age, and having had been an entrepreneur, had my own restaurants and other businesses, it gives you a different perspective, not maybe different, but just a broad perspective on learning and actually how people learn. I kind of mentioned, I alluded to that earlier. We all learn at different paces, at different stages of our life, and maybe communities of practice is a really good vehicle to promote that and to bring out the best of everybody has something to share. Even early career academics that maybe never have worked outside the third level institution sector. They also have hobbies and they have family backgrounds that, you know what, just because I was a mature student coming with years of industry experience doesn't make it any less for early career academics to share their ideas and vice versa. Just because you're a career academic doesn't mean that you can't learn from somebody like me coming in midway through their career life. So everybody has something to share.
Right. I want to pivot to discussing the COVID-19 pandemic. We conduct so much of our lives, both personal and professional, online, and the pandemic has exacerbated that. And from our own experience at HERESA, we know that COPs can be established and conducted virtually. But how do you navigate the fatigue and exhaustion some might feel towards conducting some of these activities online? And to add to that, how do you strike a balance between people's right to feel safe in the context of these ever-mutating viruses and their desire for in-person contact within a COP?
COVID has changed all of us, I think, at different levels, and none so at our working life. So we had very, very successful community of practice here at Munster Technological University, where we met face to face over a coffee and a scone. And you know, people might smile, oh, coffee and a scone, but it relaxes people. It has a different dynamic, and probably most of the chit chat and networking happens over this coffee and a scone. But we were so, as a group, we were so determined in the CPEER group that we needed even more when we were sitting, whether it was under a stairs, in the end of our bedroom, or in the kitchen, where we really needed in inverted commas, safe place to talk about our area of interest, whether, you know, it was, in our case, it's entrepreneurship, teaching and learning and research, where we could share ideas. And I think that pure determination from participants, and I know from the HERESA, is pure determination and belief in that the model of communities of practice, which has, after 2 years, they're still going strong. And, maybe it's based on what, the real true meaning of entrepreneurship and innovation is. Pivoting, resilience, change, because change is constant. So, we will hopefully go back to face-to-face communities of practice, maybe not with the HERESA because it's very geographically very broad, but there is merit in online because it's 1 hour. You are talking, one person can talk at a time. You can ask people to have timing, so it's easier. So there is merit in online as well, because I would never be speaking to the communities of practice with HERESA on a regular basis, because we're in the Northern Europe and you're down in South Africa. So look, there's merits in everything, and we will change. Maybe there's a hybrid version.
Right.
But I think going back to the COVID and the COVID change, what we've learned how to teach. So we've shared ideas on how to teach and how to research on an online world. So even down to our sharing our tricks of the world of education and research, that was done online to try and counteract the stumbling blocks that COVID has caused in delivering to the best education to our students. So I think we all have learned so much through the COVID journey. Hopefully it's over, or nearly over.
Yeah, I hope so too. And we have most certainly pivoted and adjusted towards the ever-changing nature of COVID. And my last question is, how do you see the HERESA COPs potentially aiding higher education reform and curriculum development, if at all?
Again, it goes back to that willingness to learn from your peers. And given that HERESA is an international project with many universities across South Africa, but also in Europe, we all have something to learn and something to share. And I suppose because I truly believe in the power of communities of practice, I think this is going to be one of the huge, impactful parts of HERESA. I'm not a bit biased, of course, but I think this will sustain far, far beyond the 3-year pilot. And I certainly hope so. And I hope that this podcast and the cafe conversations we have regularly through the project will support the sustainability of these communities of practice, where we learn from each other.
Wonderful. Helen, thank you so much for joining us on the HERESA podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for providing us with a really clear and hopeful definition and perception of a community of practice.
Thank you, Kenya.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen.